8 head coaching vacancies at the end of the 2023 National Football League regular season. And as of this moment, all 8 vacancies have been filled. The last to do it, the Washington Commanders, who name a new head coach for a new era for this Commanders organization. Dan Snyder is out. New ownership group outside the nation's capital, and now a new head coach. Dan Quinn, the new head coach of the Washington Commanders. Donnie, you gave it a C in terms of the grade for the hire when we opened up the show with this news about 10 minutes ago. Why is it just an average grade for you?
Well, also, here's how we can break it down, too, because if you just go based on last year, right, DeMeco Ryans gets the job at the Houston Texans, high draft pick, get a quarterback. It worked out really well for them. It did. That's the exception to the rule. Most franchises and foundations are built upon this. We have a high draft pick. We're going to pick a quarterback. Let's get the best offensive coordinator we can to get this kid started in the right direction. Bobby Sloak was really good for the Houston Texans, but also you take a look for the Carolina Panthers. Their number 1 pick didn't work out so well, and that was actually with an offensive coordinator / head coach in Frank Reich. So we're not saying that this is a terrible move, but for me, future of the NFL is getting the offensive guy and getting him to stick around here. But also, let's take a look at what went into this for the Commanders and how they wound up with Dan Quinn as their head coach. And also, this is a franchise in a little bit of turmoil, moving out of the clouds of, Dan Snyder's, the ownership group, and all the nonsense that they had to deal with for the past 25 years. I like the hirings there in the front office, and I think they did it the right way. You know what? New ownership group. Let's get new management in. Then we're going to find our general manager. Then we're going to find our head coach. I think that's a very healthy way to basically start a franchise. But here's the problem I have. You can't tell me right now that they back-channeled for weeks upon end on Ben Johnson. We heard from multiple guests here, and it just looked like it lined up that Ben Johnson was going to be your offensive coordinator. Now, the question with this is you never would have thought that when they were looking for a coach, they would have wound up with a defensive coordinator. It was like, hey, look, new ownership group, innovative, quarterbacks coming to town. Let's get the best offensive guy we can get, which really makes it interesting where the backup plan basically was a scramble to say, now we just got to get a competent coach who's been a head coach before that's going to rally the troops and we won't embarrass ourselves. That's a tough swing and miss here for the Washington Commanders. I don't care how they paint the picture, because if you remember, Ben, they got on that plane with their ownership group and front office to go meet with Ben Johnson, basically to say, you know what? Here's what we're going to pay you. Why don't you sign this and come back on the plane? We'll introduce you in a press conference the next day. They get up in the air. He says no. And they're basically like, oh, my goodness. Now we're in full scramble mode, and made sure they put out all that good PR by going like, look, we were going out there for an interview. There was no sure thing we're even going to give Ben Johnson the job. No shot, because they would have already moved. This wasn't a franchise that's like, hey, you know what? We just got knocked out of the playoffs. Now we're in a real tizzy, and we're trying to fight to see what the next head coach is going to be because it didn't work out. This was an organization that basically went through the last entire season. Once you had that once you had that ownership change, that knew they were looking for a new coach, and Ben Johnson was going to be it, and he left him at the altar. They scrambled and just had to get somebody at this point, Ben.
So we'll focus on Dan Quinn in just a moment, but that's my overall assessment and takeaway of this hire for the Commanders as well. Ben Johnson was the hottest commodity in this NFL coaching carousel. You can tell me otherwise, and you are wrong. Ben Johnson was the guy. Ben Johnson was the promising young star. Ben Johnson was that young, innovative, and creative head coach that could doctor in a new era of whatever football franchise he became the head coach of. Was it going to be a proven certainty that he was going to have success without any head coaching experience? Of course not, but he would have been the name that I think 95% of whatever fan base he went to for whatever franchise would have been like, yes, 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 we are optimistic once again about the future of my favorite football team. Dan Quinn is not that. And specifically for Washington, Donnie, it was clear the Commanders were trying to bring in this new era of an organization, trying to get out the sour taste that Dan Snyder left in Landover. It used to be a proud franchise. It used to be a proud fan base. It used to be a successful and winning franchise. They have not been that. There might be Commanders fans out there who are 20, 25, 30 years old that haven't seen success because Dan Snyder became the owner in May of 1999. In that span, up until this past season or through this season of 2023, they have never reached an NFC title game. They have hardly ever done anything in the postseason. But Donnie, in the 17 years before Dan Snyder became the head coach, the Washington Football Organization won multiple Super Bowls, played in 5 NFC championship games. They won 3 Lombardi trophies. They played in another. This was one of the most successful organizations in all of the National Football League. And I think they were trying to inspire that confidence and hope once again with a big name hire like Ben Johnson. They swung and missed on that. It falls to Dan Quinn. Again, he has had success as a head coach in the National Football League. He has that pedigree in terms of what his career has looked like. Highly regarded, and rightfully so, as one of the best defensive minds in all of the sport. We saw that these past 3 years for Dallas. We saw that before he became the head coach of the Falcons in Seattle. Legion of Boom. The Seahawks were the best scoring defense in both of his years as the DC. And he had success in Atlanta. He's just going to be remembered, as everybody is on that 2016 Falcons team, for the collapse in Super Bowl 51 against the New England Patriots and Tom Brady. It's not a knock against Dan Quinn, the person or the coach. I think it just says what the hopes were for this big first hire for the new ownership group of the Commanders, which they ultimately fell into Dan Quinn's lap.
Yes, and also, if you remember, when we're taking a look at that Atlanta regime, Dan Quinn was a very good head coach, but you know what the catalyst for that regime was? It was Matt Ryan at quarterback and also Julio Jones at wide receiver, but who was calling those plays? It was Kyle Shanahan of the San Francisco 49ers now. So if you can catch lightning in a bottle and find a guy like that, which again, let's go back in time here and say to ourselves, all right, what would have been the better coaching move? Just making Kyle Shanahan head coach in Atlanta, and you would have your dynamic play caller for the next 15, 20, 30 years if he wants to stick around and have that job. That's why it makes it so interesting, because even if we do get a scenario like we see in Detroit, like we see in Houston now, those guys are eventually moving on. If you're the head coach, you're going to stay because you're not going to get a better head coaching job in the middle of a contract. You are the head coach of that franchise in that city. That's what's questionable. But also, we do have to take that into account. I do believe the back channels were working where Ben Johnson was lined up, and maybe they're just trying to, secure a couple final details. And Ben Johnson just got really cold feet and goes, you know what? I got a really good thing in Detroit here. And next year I might be able to get the Buffalo Bills job. If that doesn't work out, I'll stick around for one more season, because there's no way. And maybe they'll try to paint this picture going, you know what? Dan Quinn was our guy all along, which they always say that. Same thing on like draft night. We couldn't believe that this player fell to us. No, you were supposed to get X player at 8. Yeah. You waited till 10. You got burned. You just want to cover this up and said you got the guy you wanted to. Dan Quinn is going to be a fine coach in Washington, but it doesn't move the needle. It shouldn't excite the fan base. And I know that front office and ownership group was hoping for different here and didn't get it. Now they just have to bide their time and hope it works out.
6 seasons in Atlanta. Dan Quinn's overall head coaching record, 43-42, 2 playoff victories as well in that span. He had 3 seasons to start where he did not have a losing record, and in 2016 and 17, double-digit wins. Then 3 straight losing seasons. He was fired following week number 5 during his final year in Atlanta, the 2020 NFL campaign. So here is the coaching carousel in the 2024 NFL offseason. And one thing that stands out, Donnie, the names not listed in these 8 new head coaching jobs: Bill Belichick and Mike Vrabel.
By the way, you take out Jim Harbaugh on that graphic for the Chargers. This was a horrendous hiring cycle. How about that? And again, not to say it can't work out, but we had rock stars available that we thought would be franchise-changing guys, and we got a lot of, that guy's the head coach? He took the job there? Who is that guy? Yeah, that usually doesn't work out all that well.
Listen, I think there are some really good hires. I love Mike McDonald in Seattle, but to Donnie's point, when Mike Vrabel was on the market and Bill Belichick was on the market, we were like, oh my God, what a time to let go of your head coach. It didn't really pan out that way.